Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Welcome to the Alliance Française Online for this wonderful event, the first of 2021, which is an exciting year since yesterday, as every one of you probably think. I want to, before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I would like to take this moment, this opportunity to recognize a couple of you who are here today, including former librarian Brigitte Pichot of Alliance Française, and teachers Bassima as well as Marie-Yasmine, who are here from Alliance Française, and of course also my dear friend Françoise Pfaff from Howard University, whom I can see there, and I'm so glad to see you. So I hope you will enjoy this wonderful event, and I will, without further ado, introduce the speakers. So Dr. Tristan Cabello is a historian of American cultures and politics. His research examines social movements with a focus on the intersection of race, sexuality, and politics. He's currently completing a book on Black Lives Matter and teaches history and critical theory at Johns Hopkins University. For those of you who are familiar with Alliance Française, you may have heard Tristan already quite a few times, as he's already been at Alliance Française in person before COVID to talk about many subjects, and including a fabulous interview with Edouard Louis in the fall of 2019, or spring rather of 2019. Dr. Pap Ndiaye is a historian of US history, specialized in African American history. He also works on the history of sociology of Afro-descendants in France. He holds an MA from the University of Virginia and a PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, EHESS, in Paris. Dr. Ndiaye has been a visiting professor at New York University and Northwestern University. He is currently working at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, what we call Sciences Po Paris, on a history of global civil rights in the 20th century. And I will now give the floor to Tristan. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to see Sarah, Natasha, and all the members of the Alliance Française. And so I guess what I'm going to do first is just to talk about and share a brief history of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and talk about a few differences and a few similarities that I see with the Black Lives Matter movement in France. So it's always difficult to talk about Black Lives Matter as a movement because it's not an organized movement to start with. It's actually a very much a decentralized, localized movement with different chapters throughout the US. And the movement started actually as a hashtag. Right after George Zimmerman in 2012, the murder of Trayvon Martin, was acquitted. And so it started as a hashtag on Twitter and gained popularity with or following the death of Michael Roman Ferguson and then Eric Garner in New York City. And it's in really the summer of 2020, after the death of George Floyd, that the movement really gained popularity, became even more visible in the US and also, I think, in France. And so we can talk later on about the reasons why something shifted in the summer of 2020. There were many reasons. It was not just the death of George Floyd. Obviously, it was a paradigm shift that happened in the summer of 2020. And it turns out that in the summer of 2020, the Comité Adama in France also gains popularity. And there's a lot of demonstration at the same time that there are many demonstrations in the US, in DC, in New York, and Chicago, and in Portland. Right after the end of the first lockdown, the Comité Adama actually manages to organize a huge demonstration next to the Court Appeal Center in Paris to mobilize its members against a decision that was decriminalizing the policemen that were involved in Adama Traoré's death. So I think that really the movement in summer 2020 crystallizes a lot of struggles, both in the US and in France. few similarities between both movements here. The call for direct actions. It's something that's very specific to those movements, and I think something in the direction in which the left, both in America and the US, is moving. In the US, demonstrating is not enough anymore for a lot of Black Lives Matter activists. Actions is what's needed, and so we've seen, several things here. We've seen, for example, the tearing down of statues in the South, because the statues, again, represented the Confederate South, those were slave owners, etc., etc. Uh, uh, the fact also, second point, the fact also that this is very much an intersectional movement. It was very obvious to see, it was very evident to see in the US in the summer of 2020, the fact that the movement really crystallizes a lot of different movements, Occupy, the Bernie Sanders movement, the Sunrise movement, too, all merged into those Black Lives Matter demonstrations that happened in June. And in France, I believe it's also very much the same thing. And it's also, I would say, the use of their use of new media. The Comité Adama in France does very much communicate with its members and its constituency through social media, and this is exactly what also the movement does in the US. If you think about people who started the movement, let's say DeRay McKesson, for example, was very much involved on Twitter, on social media. It was exactly the same for somebody like Cori Bush, for example, who was just elected recently at the House. Same thing for Jamal Bowman, same thing in another respect for AOC. Differences now, and Pap is going to talk more about this in a minute, but what is precisely this, the fact that those two movements have two different histories, and that the French movement is constantly compared to the US movement. And so it's true that those concerns have been invisibilized for a long time in France due to a lack of, well, race-based data too. But also the fact that it's constantly compared to the movement in the US minimizes in many ways, what's happening in France. And also, those are movements that have been criticized for trying to communitarize a French society. Contrary to what I'm finding in the US, I find that the movement in France is not grounded in institutional politics. In the US, again, I mean, there have been many Black Lives Matters activists who have been elected to official position. Cori Bush, Ayanna Pressley, Bowman. And there's been, for example, a lot of Black Lives Matter activists who were members of DSA and who were also elected pretty recently in Queens and in Brooklyn. Le Comité Adama, for example, in France, is very cautious of course, the Parti Socialiste, but also of most more leftist parties like La France Insoumise, for example. And finally, I find that those activists are not as present in mainstream politics and in mainstream media as they are in the US. or at least they're not, well, they're not found guilty to be, right? So in the US, I mean, we have seen those activists everywhere in the media. They've been on major mainstream media like MSNBC, for example. I remember Dory Mackison, having a show on BET for a while. So those people are very present. While, for example, somebody like Assa Traoré, who is very much, who seems to be more revered in the US, who was on the cover of Time magazine, for example, recently, but much less liked or revered by mainstream media in France. And so we can get into much more details, after Pap's presentation. But that's what I wanted to say as an introduction.
Pap, if you would like to take over.
Yeah. Good evening or good afternoon to you all. It's a real pleasure to speak and interact with you. I mean, I'm in Paris. It's a little late, but I'm definitely awake tonight to speak to you. And following up on Tristan's point, I want to underline my main idea, which is that there is a long history, a French history of protest against police brutalities, and a history of police brutalities and structural racism within the police in France that needs to be highlighted, so as not to see the recent protest that took place in France, especially in June and July following the murder of George Floyd, as just a spin-off of what happened in the United States. There is a local history of protest that needs to be highlighted, which does not mean that this history is insulated and completely disconnected from an international environment, and especially what happens in the United States. So my first point would be to insist on the fact that the French police has targeted colonial subjects, or targeted colonial subjects, or post-colonial subjects, at least since the 1920s, when the first specific police unit was created with the specific purpose to target the colonial subjects that lived in metropolitan France. The purpose was to figure out their political activities, whether they had any connection with revolutionary organizations such as the Communist Party, and this specific police unit reported to the police headquarters in Paris, as well as to the Minister of the Colonies. That is also good for historians, of course, since we have the archives of all the colonial groups and that were created in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, thanks to those police archives. So there is this emergence in the interwar period of specific police units. But the most important moment is that of the Algerian War that really started in the mid-1950s. This is really when the police in France, in metropolitan France, started to use methods that were used in the colonial world. The use of weapons, the use of firearms, the use of lethal violence became common in Paris and in major towns such as Marseille or Lyon by the mid-50s and in the late 50s and early 1960s. Historians have documented how demonstrations taking place in Paris in the late 1950s faced the police brutality in ways which classic demonstrations, for example, the trade unions or even political demonstrations, were immune to. The police used weapons, killed demonstrators, such as in the demonstration in the 13th arrondissement in 1958. And of course, there is this notorious demonstration that took place in the fall of 1961, when possibly hundreds of Algerians were killed by the French police and their bodies thrown into the Seine River. This is one of the most notorious, one of the most tragic moments in the history of French post-World War II France. And this moment has been fairly well documented now. We don't know exactly how many people were killed, but it's obvious that hundreds of people were killed. Bodies were found all the way to the English Channel in the following days. The head of the police in Paris was Maurice Papon. Maurice Papon started his career by collaborating with the Nazis during World War II, and Maurice Papon was responsible for the deportation of hundreds of Jewish persons during the Second World War, and he somehow survived following the war and managed to keep his position all the way to become, in the 1970s, under President Giscard, to become a minister. And this is when newspapers started to publish papers on his past of collaborator with the Nazis, of course, but also what he did in the early 1960s when he ordered the French police to kill Algerians. This is something I often tell my students. More people were killed by the police in Paris in the early 1960s than in the United States, than in some parts of the United States, including the South, with the civil rights movement. We're talking about hundreds of people being killed at that time by the Paris police. It is also interesting to see that policemen who were stationed in the colonial world were sent back to metropolitan France in the early 60s to use their specific methods, as well as to some colonial or overseas departments such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, where these policemen also behaved in the most brutal way when, for example, crushing the demonstrations that took place in Martinique in 1959. So we can witness the spread of a massive forms of violence by the police targeting the colonial / post-colonial subjects at that time. We should also look at long traditions within the French police of training, targeting non-whites, which still exist today. Race profiling by the French police is an everyday reality of major cities such as Paris, but also the suburbs and elsewhere in France. There are internal histories and old policemen who proudly tell of their time back in the 1970s when they also behaved and told and heard about the stories that took place in the early 1960s and sometimes even before. So there is this kind of dark memory among the police and this idea that they have to behave in specific ways, and this is how a French policeman should behave. This is something also that has affected non-white policemen. There are many testimonies of Black and Arab policemen who have complained about the way they are being treated by their colleagues in police stations. The way they get nicknames, racist nicknames, racist jokes every day. This is also a reality which non-white policemen have to face nowadays in France. I also want to insist on another long history, that of protest, as I said, that also started in the 1920s with newspapers, small newspapers run by colonial activists who denounced the behavior and the tactics of the police, the way they were being treated, the way they were being interrogated, and so on and so forth. Also, of course, in the 1950s, there is a protest, there are various forms of protest against the police in Paris and Marseille. There are demonstrations, as I said, sometimes crushed with people being killed, but there are also members of parliament who protested, including Aimé Césaire, for example, who protested against the behavior and the way police treated the colonial subjects. They were not called subjects anymore, but this is what they were in reality. So there is something that is also part of a long tradition. Organizations such as the League of Human Rights, which also protested, not so strongly sometimes, but they also protested back in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, nowadays we are witnessing a new generation which was not born following the murder of George Floyd. There is a recent and very strong history of protest against race profiling and police and various forms of structural racism coming from the police with various groups, including Black Lives Matter. For example, in my own institution, Sciences Po, there is a very active Black Lives Matter group, which has more than 50 students. And this group was organized, I think, at least 5 or 6 years ago. So that's something that has been around for quite a bit of time with students organizing various things, not sometimes just doing little roundtables, interviewing people, Facebook pages, the social media being very, very important here. So this has only been reactivated and went to another scale in June and July. The main difference, I think, is that this time we've seen a lot of white people, just like in the United States, a lot of white people who have joined these demonstrations. When Adama Traoré was killed back in July of 2016, the demonstrations that took place in Paris, but also in the suburbs, were mostly demonstrations by Black people, Afro-descendants. And this time, this was quite different. We could see a lot of white people, for example, around the Justice Court in the 17th arrondissement, this massive demonstration that took place. At least 20,000 people, many people, including myself, couldn't even access the area where the demonstration took place, in spite of the fact that this demonstration was officially illegal. Tens of thousands of people came and it was very obvious that these people were mostly young people, not always, but mostly young people, but a lot of white people. So this is, I would argue, the striking new dimension of this recent demonstration. It is not that they did not exist before. As I said, there is a long history of it. It is that they are more multicultural, in some ways multiracial, than they were just back a few years ago when hundreds of people protested, mostly Black people. Another interesting and original feature, I think, is very much like the US, women, a lot of women are very much at the forefront of these demonstrations, these BLM France groups. As I said, the Comité Traoré, of course, Comité Adama. So there is a very strong female dimension with feminist ideas also being mixed and being discussed along with the protest against racial oppression. So that's something that just did not exist 20 years ago, for example. So that's also something quite striking that did not exist to the same extent, for sure, back in the 1950s and 1960s. So to sum it up, I think it's important to avoid the analysis that would just explain the strength of the French protest movement as being an imitation of the American movement. Of course, they are connected. Of course, the murder of George Floyd had an immense impact throughout the world, including in France, but also in countries which you would not suspect. Switzerland, for example, is the country which had the largest demonstrations in relation to the population, of course. So that's very important to look at the connection, to look at the social media, to look at all this. But it is also important to study the local dynamics, the historical dynamics that help explain why they take off, why there are so many people, why people built the analysis mixing George Floyd with Adama Traoré and others. The last point that also struck me was that for the first time, I think, there's demonstrations taking place in Paris, but also elsewhere in France, where both in French and English, you could find a lot of signs with Black Lives Matter, of course, but also signs in English. People would also speak in English. There were discourses, speeches by various people in English, a mix of English and French. So this is something I had never seen before. So that is also a testimony, of course, of the connection and I would argue, the international dimension of the movement. There were many also foreign international students, for example, participating in the demonstrations in Paris. So you could hear a lot of languages, people speaking English with various accents, Spanish, whatever. There are many, many different things. So the cosmopolitan international dimension was very strong. And this is something that you wouldn't find, of course, a few decades ago. So again, new things that needs to be stressed, but also a long history, a long French history, in many ways that needs to be highlighted so as to avoid the idea that it's all coming from the United States, of course.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Ndaye. I will ask Tristan, because what you just said now was interesting, that there was such an international dimension, and there were signs in multiple languages in France, in English, and then you could hear people speak, English. Of course, in the United States, we would definitely hear people speak Spanish. But I'm going to ask Tristan, did you have that same dimension? Were you aware of the same dimension? Was it in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States? You think that they had such an international dimension or not? Because people who are not U.S. citizens in the U.S., if they're arrested demonstrating, they can be banned, from the U.S. So, would you care to comment on that one, Tristan?
Yeah, so that's not really what I've seen in the demonstration in the U.S. because, as you said, it is pretty dangerous for somebody who is a foreigner not to demonstrate in the U.S. However, what I've seen is exactly what Pap has seen in Paris. It's much more of a multiracial, of a multi-generational movement. Women were very much involved. It was. Let's not forget also that it was right, and I think this is exactly what happened also in France. It was right after COVID, right after the first lockdown, and so that was right around the time where uh, people did realize that they could die too because of their race. Most people who died in the vast majority of people who died in the United States, African American communities were much more impacted by COVID than any others, for example. And so it was just at a moment where all those structural inequalities came to light. And so what we've seen also in Washington D.C. Is indeed, like Pab said, you know, a lot of white people being very much included and very much present. I mean, just right here around 14th Street, 16th Street, and around the mall. I remember seeing like older white people being in the streets and giving water or just food to the demonstrators. And so that type of thing did happen. It was it was a much more broader movement, and it was also a much more broader movement. I think in politics. I think in many ways it synthesized, you know, the remains of the Bernie Sanders movement, the remains of the Occupy movement, the fight for climate change too. It was there was very little violence, contrary to what has been told in the media. You know, it was very telling to see the businesses that were vandalized on Connecticut on 16th Street were not your regular pop and mom's businesses. It was the banks. It was the banks that were attacked. You know, and so I think that's also very telling about how most of those activists conceptualize their political agenda, and those are really grounded, you know, in the movements that we've seen recently. You know, going back to ACT UP, to Occupy, to the Bernie Sanders movement, that this type of inequalities are structural, that capitalism and racism goes hand in hand. And so what the discourses that was emerging was very much that, you know, racial, social, climate, sexual, gender inequalities are all connected, and you cannot just focus on one in order to solve the other. They have to be solved, or they have to be tackled at the same time.
So would you, both of you, this is a question for both of you, and then I will go to what is in the chat, because some people have started entering questions in the chat. However, if I understood well what you both said, and that's why I'm addressing the question to both of you, it seems like the Black Lives Matter activists in the US are having a more of a political life, because they are running for elections and they are being elected. But it seems that it is not the case in France. Or did I get that wrong? Can you both extrapolate? Maybe Pap, you start, and then Tristan take over after.
Yeah, I would say that the Black Lives Matter activists in France have a more marginal position from an institutional standpoint than their American counterparts. They do not, they are mostly seen as activists who are sometimes called communautaristes, meaning that they would have a racial focus which is not well considered in the French republicanism, as they are being accused of breaking with the French Republic. So there is a very powerful and negative language which they have to fight. Also, they are not so welcome when it comes to running for elections, for example, by classic political organizations. So I would say that even if, in spite of the strength of the movement, which we witnessed last spring, in June, July, they remain marginal, and they do not have the same kind of political weight and influence which Black Lives Matter has managed to get in the US. There is also in France a tradition of anti-racism, which is a tradition of defeats, if I may say. What the French lack, I would argue, is a history of heroes, the way they are celebrated in the United States. The French anti-racist movement often sees itself as in a very defensive position, without the kind of celebrated moments which the US have. There is no French civil rights movement. There is no equivalent to Dr. King or Malcolm X, to name a few. So there is this also this lack of historical reference, which is also an issue, which is not to say that they do not exist, of course, but they do not enjoy, they do not have the same kind of centrality in collective memories, which the civil rights movement activists have. So that's also a part of the, that helps explain the relative weakness of when comparing, of course, the French movement to the American movement. So it's also important for historians to highlight, which I briefly alluded to, that is this history of protest, this history of protest against colonialism, which is which with people, with persons, with that also need to be more well known, that sometimes need to be celebrated. There is an issue about street names in France, as the French government seems to be willing to give street names to a number of anti-colonial heroes, following a report just released on the memory of the Algerian War, for example. So all of this is important, so as to create, to highlight the history, and also to create a memory where the struggle against colonialism would be celebrated.
Tristan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Pap said. In the US, it's true that those Black Lives Matter activists have been much more integrated into institutional politics, and they're following also, like, here again, a long tradition, I would say, that dates back to Jesse Jackson in the late 70s. There's this concept of like the Rainbow Coalition. You know, in the late 1970s, Jesse Jackson decides that it's time to have black mayors, you know, in America, and in order to get black mayors elected, they are building rainbow coalitions, integrating, you know, feminist movements, working class movements, union movements, LGBT movements. You know, never forget that in America, for example, the first people who asked for marriage equality are African American mayors in the early 80s. Absolutely, and there are a lot of Black Lives Matters activists who have become, you know, official politicians. The first one that comes to mind, of course, just at the beginning, because he was such a visible figure, was Doreen Mackison, you know, who ran for to be mayor of Baltimore, and then of course. The string of Justice Democrats that were just elected in the past election was also telling. Cori Bush, you know, Presley, Jamal Bowman, who are joining AOC on the squad. I mean, all of those, you know, have had an impact. I have also to say that the Democratic Socialist Party have seen an increase in its member in the past year, following the summer of 2020 riots. And it's also important to mention, you know, that the Black Lives Matter activists and in conjunction with Sunrise, the Sunrise movement, had a very central impact on what happened in Georgia. A lot of people were sent from New York to Georgia to organize for the election of Ossoff and the Reverend Warnock. And so here, there too, racial politics were at play. You know, I mean, Warnock was darkened on the commercials. Ossoff had this nose launched in the commercials too. The Black Lives Matter activists that were involved there also helped creating this movement and eventually getting those two senators elected.
We have a very interesting question from Cathy Fuchs, and I will take the questions by order, and then Natasha will take the second one. But Cathy has a double question. She asks, how have you seen these movements affecting the US and France's soft power influence and diplomatic legitimacy? In other countries, especially on the African continent. In other words, are these historical, structural, racial inequality issues impacting American and/or French international standing and influence abroad?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That reminds me of a long conversation I had with Emmanuel Macron last week. And I was telling him that when Michel Zecler, this black man, was severely beaten by the French police. You may have heard of that. He was just getting in his place, and the police stormed in his studio, and he was beaten, and he was very much injured, and that created a scandal in France, and massive demonstration was organized to protest against police brutalities. So this was back in November. And this triggered a lot of interest, many papers in American newspapers, but also in Africa and elsewhere. I got WhatsApp messages from my cousins in West Africa wondering about what was going on in Paris. So I told the president that this had a clear effect on France and the way France pretends to be at the forefront of human rights. It is impossible to be this country where human rights were born, supposedly, where human rights are proclaimed to be a #1 priority, and in the same time have these horrible images of policemen brutalizing a black man in Paris. This is not something that is a positive thing, and clearly the world, or part of the world, was also looking at the way the French government reacted following what happened in Paris. So it's interesting that the president, for the first time, spoke of a form of institutional racism or structural racism, when in fact the police trade unions always deny that there is any form of structural racism within the police. So there are things that start to move very slowly. But speaking of structural racism now in France is not as impossible almost as it used to be. It's slowly getting into the conversation, into the standard democratic conversation in France, which was not the case a year ago when you would speak of that. So there are things taking place, and I strongly believe that the image of France, the echoes from all around the world, including from the United States, play a role in the way the government reacted following the beating of this black man in Paris.
The Diane question is, can you speak about France's colorblind approach to race relations impacts one of you mentioned there was no race data in France, which dates back to what happened in World War II because of the rounding up of the Jews when the Jews had to sign up, at the police station during World War II. And after that, that's when France decided not to have any race data. But how can you speak about that? Because the French tend to forget that historical aspect and they just say they colorblind. Approach to race relations impacts the French Black Lives Matter movement.
It is clear that we do not have the same kind of statistics as the one that exists in the United States or in some European countries such as the United Kingdom. And there is this kind of official colorblind policy, which is a huge problem indeed when it comes to highlighting the very existence of racial disparities and racial discriminations. However, it is not true to say that there are no racial statistics in France. There are some statistics. It is possible to build such statistics. It is not easy. It's not as common as in the United States, for sure. But there are some statistics. For example, the CSA, which is this official authority in charge of looking at the French TV, every year publishes statistics related to the French TV, non-whites, blacks, Asians, people of Asian descent, Arab descent, etc., about the fiction and non-fiction programs of the French TV. So that's one example among a few others that show that we're not in a world where these statistics do not exist. But we need more statistics. There are some statistics related to the behavior of the police. A black man has up to 20 times is more likely to be race profiled or to be interrogated by the police than a white person. So it's we have some data about all this, but we still have a lot a lot of road to cover, but clearly things are moving a little, not fast for sure, but they are moving. There's a growing awareness that the standard colorblind discourse has failed to address issues of racial discrimination. But I'm not saying it's a majority of people, but it's a growing awareness. That's how I would put it. And this awareness did not exist 20 years ago when I came back from the United States, back to France, when I settled in Paris. It was almost impossible to speak of racial statistics in France. Now it is possible. So that's a little, that makes me a little optimistic.
Yeah, and if I can add something on the American side here, is that it seems that we're going one step further here now, because those identities actually do not really mean anything to the younger generation. What I've seen in many of my classes is that more and more students, are trying to create their own language, their own identities, their own racial identities. So a lot of time, the box other, the box mix is being ticked. And same thing for gender, same thing for sexual orientation. It seems that the new generation, I mean, especially millennials, are creating new language, new discourses, and new ways to look at those identity politics.
And so here we have another great question by Kathy, and I'll let Dr. Capello answer that first. So what consequences, if any, do you predict the American and French governments will face if they do not create real change or implement effective action what are potential consequences for American and French society if these issues are not meaningfully addressed?
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about the new president, for example. The way they are targeting, the way they are trying to address racial issues with the new administration is by having all this diversity in the government, which is a wonderful thing because representation matters because it opens up, a field of possibilities for a younger generation too. Uh, but at the same time, uh, some scholars of diversity have argued that firsts do not always matter, do not always impact society at a ground level. And that's why we've seen, for example, with the presidency of Barack Obama, we always have to remember and to remind people that the Black Lives Matter movement was born during the presidency of Barack Obama. Barack Obama deported many more people, for example, than George W. Bush. My point here being that often when we try to fight systemic racism, it's those examples that are giving back to us. Well, I mean, why are you saying that the US is systematically racist? Because we have elected a black president, we have elected a black vice president, et cetera, et cetera. So most of the time, those things that are meant to be helpful and progressive are usually coming back to us when we are trying to make real change.
Monsieur Ndaya, do you want to add anything in terms of France and the situation in France about that?
About the question on the consequences.
Right,
yeah.
exactly, if the real change is not taken.
I'm not sure. As a historian, I tend to look back rather than forward. It's somehow easier. I do not make predictions. I look at the current situation, which is not only that of an anti-racist movement that is definitely stronger now than it was a year ago, but it is also a moment when the extreme right is very strong and very influential on French politics. So that's also something to take into account when looking at the French situation. The fact that well, you had Trump up until yesterday. We have the extreme right, which is not in power, but very strong, very influential on these issues. And I would argue that the extreme right is definitely more organized and stronger these days than the anti-racist movement. The anti-racist movement faces a lot of difficulties, including divisions between the so-called universalist, the old style colorblind tradition, which we alluded to, and a new generation of activists who sweep on the side the old colorblind republicanism to highlight the existence of racial discrimination. They do not hesitate to speak of race, which is something very unusual in France. Speaking of using a language with race and racial issues, that's highly uncommon, and a lot of people who would proclaim to be anti-racist are extremely reluctant to speak of racial issues because races are supposed not in existence. They do not exist. So they stick to this classic colorblind perspective. So that's one very strong issue, that of the divisions. Plus, as I said, the extreme right. So the situation is not perfect, to say the least, and the upcoming presidential election may very well see again the National Front, the extreme right organization, being at the forefront, not winning, but being at the forefront and influencing even more French politics. So we are in a very, very tough situation with a stronger anti-racist movement facing, I would say, an even stronger nationalist, xenophobic, racist movement. Very unhappy of Trump's defeat, for sure, but that remains very strong in this country.
We have a couple of more interesting questions, most of them directed at the situation in France, as I guess there's more need to know more about that. Let me just find it. So it was a question from Jacqueline Rose, who's commenting and asking, the first I heard of obvious racial problems in the movement in France were the Touche pas mon pote and sauce racism activities, yes. Has either of those lingered and had effects on present movements?
I'm not sure, because SOS Racisme was strong back in the 1980s, but has been widely criticized, and especially in the popular neighborhoods where non-whites tend to live. SOS Racisme is not very popular among those people. It's often seen as a very static institutional organization, which doesn't look seriously at the at what people face in their everyday lives. So that is why we have witnessed the emergence of smaller, more agile organizations, grassroots organizations such as the Comité Adama, and these organizations distance themselves from the old style universalistic organizations such as SOS Racisme. So there is something going on in the anti-racist movement, which has somehow left behind the League of Human Rights, or SOS Racisme, in many ways.
And if I can just add something on SOS Racisme, and a lot of historians have actually trying to show also that the movement was created by the Socialist Party, or was actually built by the Socialist Party at the time, in order to put the emphasis in the media on racial politics, and also as a result to make sure that the extreme right would rise, and therefore, would also help more institutional, right party, conservative party to fail, and therefore help the Socialist Party to remain in power. So there's a lot of history here right there that we don't really truly know about SOS Racisme, but it was an intriguing movement.
If I may jump on this question by Gretchen on cultural institutions, I'd be more than happy to say a few words on that, because I've just finished a big study report on discriminations and diversity at the Opéra de Paris. And the question is, in the US, many museums and other cultural institutions issued statements in support of BLM and against racism after the murder of George Floyd. Have French museums made similar statements? So that's really interesting, because many artists, including dancers and musicians at the Opéra de Paris, protested the silence of their institutions during the demonstrations last June. And they asked the opera or the museums to say something about what was going on. And at the Opéra de Paris, a group of non-white dancers wrote a manifesto to ask for significant changes at the opera, the recruitment of non-white dancers, more than a few non-white musicians, the end of various forms of microaggressions, and also significant changes in the opera and ballet that often feature racist or semi-racist stories and characters. So this triggered a very interesting movement, and I was in charge of writing a report which will be released next week. But there's been quite a bit of talk about all this already in French newspapers to figure out how an institution such as the Opera can answer the demands from Black Lives Matter within its own ranks. And I believe that such central institutions as the Louvre and Orsay have also been facing similar issues, maybe not to the same extent, but are also facing issues related to the world of curators, for example, which is all white, and the world of janitors, which is all black in these prestigious institutions. So this is also as if what was seen as normal in France, you know, a curator is white, a security person at the museum is black, and that's how it is. This was seen as normal for the longest time. And now there is this growing awareness, this growing feeling that something is wrong, that this is not what it should be. This is not that it's not because it is because there are issues related to justice, to racial justice in France. This awareness that things need to change somehow. So of course, people, you know, the heads of museum want change at a slow pace. They are not revolutionaries, for sure. But I think that a window has opened for a few months, and I believe that that's another positive effect of the massive mobilization that followed the murder of George Floyd.
I have a great comment and a question from Jennifer Fulton, who says, first of all, thank you for a great discussion. And so she's inquiring into what French language books and authors do recommend for further insights into both countries' movements.
So I can start with that one. In French, Assa Traoré has written actually a book with the philosopher Geoffroy de la Gannerie, and it's called The Combat d'Ama, and I think it summarizes beautifully the issues that concern the history in a very radical way, but excellent. And I think it's very approachable. It's very readable for a non-native speaker too.
Monsieur Ndiaye, do you have any recommendations in terms of books published in France on this topic? Jennifer Fulton was asking about any literature to read further on this topic.
Yeah, Tristan mentioned a book, which is a great book, of course. There's when it comes to BLM, and it's not as if there was a ton of books that have come out since last spring. For example, I would recommend articles that have been published since last spring. The best bet, I suppose, would be to send a small bibliography to the Alliance Française, if it's possible, so that you can all find what is available, and it's going to take less time than mentioning all these references.
Yes, absolutely. We can prepare that together with you, and I can send it as a follow-up to all the attendees, even to those who probably couldn't attend. Nelson is asking, in which regions in France is the anti-racism movement is strong? I don't know if you can mention a particular region, if it's different.
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I would basically say the metropolitan areas, the large metropolitan areas are clearly the places where you would find the largest movements because of demography for sure, but also because of the more multiracial population, more diverse population. Paris is an obvious case, of course, but you find Lille and Marseille and Lyon and Bordeaux. Also cities with a large student population. We don't have college towns the way they exist in the US, but there are cities with a huge college population, college student, undergrad student population, such as Rennes, for example, in Brittany. And in fine, if you look at Rennes in Brittany, there were huge demonstrations in June and July, and there's a long tradition of protest and leftist groups in a city such as Rennes. So that's one example among others, and this echoes, of course, what also took place in the United States, the demonstrations that took place in larger cities, but also in smaller towns, including college towns where the students mobilized in ways which the US hadn't experienced since the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War protest in many ways.
Thank you. I guess I will take the last question because it's getting late, especially in France. So Sabine is asking which French party could be considered an ally of the anti-racist movements.
It's hard to say. The obvious answer would be parties on the left. The Greens, the Green Party would be fairly in connection with the youth and a number of issues which have surfaced these past few years, as Tristan mentioned, the environmental issues, climate change, of course, the Me Too movement and anti-racism are the three, this kind of political triangle that where the youth is organized and politicized. So I would say that the Green Party would be the party which is more in connection than others. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, and if I can just add something to this, a lot of the people that Assa Traoré, which doesn't represent the whole Black Lives Matter movement, of course, Geoffroy Laganerie, Didier Ribon, Edouard Louis, are all closely connected to Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, La France Insoumise, and so that's also one of their allies there.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this very insightful conversation, Dr. Tristan Cabillot from Johns Hopkins University and Dr. Papen Derrière from Sciences Po, connecting from France, which is very late there right now. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your great questions. And as a reminder, this has been recorded and will be on Alliance Française YouTube channel. Thank you very much again. Have a nice end of your week and see you soon. À bientôt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.